Hi, it's our time to talk again. Well, I talk, and you decide if you want to listen. And as I'm grading, and I'm almost done grading throughout most of the assignments you have, a few needs assignments are still being graded as almost as I speak. But I wanted to talk about some things that you've discussed in your discussion boards that I thought I might want to weigh in and add a layer to the discussion. The first thing I wanted to say is that I find the discussions delightful, and I love the way that you are adding layers from your own experiences and from what you're reading, you're seeing, and especially the network of informants, for lack of better words, that you have created in the process of doing this class, especially if you are not right now teaching and you have to talk to others. And some of you have decided to go out of state on purpose, which was fantastic because um, one of the things you've all noticed is that there's a variety of ways to approach RTI, and it's done differently in different states, sometimes differently in different schools. And I've commented on that before, but I think that's something that makes RTI stronger. Um, One of the things that came up is whether it's a pendulum going back and forth or whether there's a progress in a specific direction. And while there's sometimes the sense of a pendulum swinging in education and we go from one side to the other, I would argue that at times we've seen the pendulum move in the media and in the way the public talks about education. But from looking at the last 30 years or so in education, I would argue that there is no pendulum swinging at this point. So there's no back and forth. There might be a pendulum, but it keeps moving in the same direction. The time frame might be bigger, and eventually the pendulum will move in a different direction or go back in time. But it seems like ever since the big report that came out in Education, a Nation at Risk, and it's been close to 30 years, there has been a constant movement in a specific direction, regardless of who's in power, who runs the administration, and what are the general goals. So there might be certain deviations and slight turns to the right or left, but in general, in education, accountability has become a bigger and bigger issue. Assessments have become a bigger issue. And the involvement of the federal government and legislation in general, both at the state level and at the federal level, seem to be growing. That is less true in Nebraska, for example, Iowa, and some other states around us, where we've enjoyed a couple of things. We've enjoyed a lot of local control and at the same time quite a bit of educational success, which helps maybe shield us from a federal involvement, because federal involvement tends to rely on instruments of persuasion through funding and not through legislation. Actually, the law, the federal law, prohibits from dictating to states curricula or specific assessment practices. It allows to create guidelines, like it's got to be research based, that is a guideline, but it cannot be something specific that tells us what to do. As a result, for example, the Common Core standards are not really federal standards per se, at least theoretically, they are adapted by the governors. So the governors worked together on this with the federal government, but they are the ones pushing it, and every state is free to adapt or not adapt it. And the carrot that the federal government uses is any grants, any title monies, and all of that are at least partially dependent on accepting those. So that's the carrot they use, but in general, they can't mandate, which is what brings to this divergence in how RTI is implemented, because this is left up to states, and some states leave it even up to districts. I would argue that this is not necessarily bad, because there are such big differences, even in this class, between teachers who work or want to work in larger districts like Lincoln Public Schools and some of you that are working in rural districts where resource disbursement is very, very different the kind of professionals you have in your area that can support are very, very different. So even if a rural school has the facilities, has the ability to hire, it doesn't always have access to the professionals that can do that kind of job. And I've seen that throughout my work with rural schools. Some schools are able to, others aren't. It really depends on who lives there and how far they are from other potentially bigger places. It's harder to recruit a literacy coach for a very limited amount of time that you are sure you have funding for when you're far, far away from any other urban center, and that presents with quite a challenge, I think, for rural districts. There was an interesting strand of discussion that came up a couple of times, and that was about whether high schools can and should do RTI. And I don't know if they should or shouldn't. I do know that this kind of intervention seems to be most effective from our research earlier on, and less effective as time wears on. So there's definitely an argument to be made for focusing on elementary and middle school. Will it work in high school? I would argue that if you find the right structure for it, there is the potential to work in high school, but only for students who are significantly behind. And then you've got to ask yourself, and I have many times because my teaching career has been, quite a bit of it has been with secondary students with learning disabilities. And the question then becomes, if I've got a 10th grader who's reading at a second grade level, can I raise their reading scores? Absolutely. Can I bring them to a 10th grade reading level in 1 year? Probably not. So the question is, what other strategies and what other ways do we have at the secondary level to provide students with tools that can help them learn high school level materials without negotiating all of the texts that a 10th grader is required to use, let's say, in history. And that's where there's a big difference between those periods when we talk about learning to read and reading to learn. As we shift to reading to learn, and as we shift to considerably more challenging situations, it becomes harder to know what the place of response to intervention would be versus teaching compensatory strategies as part of a mix of approaches. And again, I'm not giving up at students. I'm not teaching them how to read. But at the same time, we have to realize where our students are and how far we can push them forward and what's the most productive thing, knowing that in a short amount of time they're going to graduate, and that it is probably true that they have had many interventions throughout their career in school and not all of them successful, or they wouldn't be with us that far behind. So those are the things that I think about. As far as reaching 100% and being all successful, I want to make one final point about that, and that is that to turn systems around, which is a phrase we all like to use, or to make significant reform in any area in schools, research tells us that takes 5 to 7 years. This is one of the reasons we don't have that much data. People talk about how effective it is and isn't, but it really will take 5 to 7 years of implementing it seriously to know if we've turned things around or not. I have my suspicions, but this is something that I want you to keep in mind. One word about assignments and reflections and the things you're putting online is I enjoy reading that very much, and I've scored the first 2 modules, and I've seen that you've started posting on the third one. But one of the things that I want you to develop is, while you're supportive and you're understanding and you're sometimes excited about the practices, I want you to also be critical. Where are the pitfalls? What are the things that we need to be careful about as we think about this? And some of you have raised it, whether it's about high school or about what do we do with students who are severely or profoundly disabled, and what do we do with them? What do we do when budgets are short and all of that? So I want you to consider all of that and to add that critical layer. So whenever you're excited about something, part of us has to be also realistic and critical. And sometimes it's critical just to find out that there are answers to those criticisms, but pretending everything is rosy and peachy is also problematic. So I'll see you next week. Bye.